everybody. I'm Kate Still. I'm the Scientific Director of the Foundation. Welcome back to our scientific sessions of our PMSF We Are Family Conference. We have a great session today about medical marijuana and CBD in epilepsy and in other symptom areas. And we have a great speaker with us, Dr. Eric Marsh. So I will pull up a brief word from our sponsor, and then I will introduce Dr. Marsh.
Our mission at Jaguar is to accelerate breakthroughs in gene therapy for patients with severe genetic diseases.
With gene therapy, we can give the opportunity at a better life. That's what makes Jaguar special.
Dr. Marsh is an attending pediatric neurologist in the Division of Neurology at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or CHOP. He is also clinical director of the Orphan Disease Center and associate professor of neurology and pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Marsh's research lab is focused on understanding how changes in brain development lead to epilepsy, intellectual disability, and autism. He studies several neurodevelopmental disorders and epilepsy with similar features to PMS. He is also an expert on the emerging use of CBD in drug-resistant epilepsy and has been involved in several clinical trials in this area. Welcome, Dr. Marsh. We are thrilled to have you.
Thank you for inviting me to talk to the families. I know this is a subject that continues to be at the tip of everyone's tongues when they want to think about treating seizures or other issues in kids with neurodevelopmental disorders. And so today I'm going to kind of tell a little bit of a story, kind of how I got into this, but also how the field has progressed since I started learning about this and being involved in this kind of from the beginning of the surge of interest in pediatric epilepsy now almost 10 years ago now. It's crazy how time flies. So I was involved in a number of studies with GW Pharma, and then also funded by the state of Pennsylvania for an expanded access program. And I'm going to talk about those studies, and that all that has been FDA approved now, and then a few other disclosures that are not relevant to this talk. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the background of this, tell you a little bit about the plant and some of its biology, then go over some of the clinical data that exists and would be useful for families, and then kind of go a little bit into dispensaries, and then kind of conclude and then answer any questions that you might have. So, why cannabis, right? Cannabis has been around for centuries. People have been using it recreationally, medicinally, and also from a religious point of view around the world for centuries. And there are reports of medical marijuana use in India, a number of centuries BC, is reports of the Greeks and the Romans using it for medical purposes, but then it went cold. And it went cold due to laws that were enacted in the US, which the AMA was actually against back in the 1940s and 50s when these laws were enacted. And then there have been some use of it and some legal cases that kind of paved the way for its use for glaucoma and cancer, primarily in California and Colorado. And then Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who was anti-medical marijuana, had a 1-hour documentary called Weed in August of 2013, so almost 10 years ago, where he reversed his position on medical marijuana. And this was based upon his reporting and his interviewing the family of Charlotte Figge, who was a little girl with Dravet syndrome in California, in Colorado, who had failed all medications, and then she was given a strain of marijuana that was high in CBD and low in THC, and she became seizure-free. And this 1-hour report talking about the company, the realm of caring, and this family, then led to an explosion of people's interest. And in my clinic, which has many patients with severe epilepsy, but also Dravet, I was being inundated with questions about this. So what is cannabis? I think everyone here knows this, but just so that we're all on the same page, it comes by many names, pot, hashish, hemp, marijuana, many other names that people probably have heard as they were growing up. And it grows indigenously in Central and South Asia. Cannabis sativa is the hemp plant that is a fibrous plant. Its fibers are extremely strong, can be used to make rope and fabrics. And the fiber is one of the strongest natural fibers known to people. And then Cannabis indica is a plant that has more resin than fiber. And it's that resin that is psychoactively active. These are different strains of the same plant. It's kind of the difference between a Labrador and a golden retriever. They're essentially the same thing, just slightly different expressions of a few genes. Cannabis use recreationally and for religious purposes is primarily driven by its major ingredient, which is tetrahydrocannabidiol, which is THC. It's the psychoactive mind-altering component of it. It modulates our desire to eat, anxiety, learning, memory, and is mind-altering. The typical marijuana plant that is used recreationally is relatively high in THC, averages about 13% THC and very low in CBD, less than 2%. And there are plants that can be as high as 37% THC that are bred to this. And there's even reports now of some plants getting as high as 40 to 50% of their cannabinoids being THC. So while the cannabinoids are the most well-known and distinctive chemical class of compound within the cannabis plant, there are over 489 identifiable chemicals, and the other ones that people think might have bioactive properties and be potentially therapeutic include the terpenes, the phenols, and the flavonoids. These compounds are known to have some antioxidant and other potential benefits to human health. So CBD is the aspect of medical marijuana that has gotten the most attention for seizures, sleep, anxiety, and development in kids with neurodevelopmental disorders. And it does seem to be the component that lowers seizures. It should be noted that THC can actually be pro-epileptic in certain cases and make seizures worse, but in other situations, it's potentially anti-epileptic. The strain that Dr. Gupta made famous, Charlotte's Web, which was produced by the Realm of Caring, was extremely high in CBD, about 17% CBD, and low in THC. CBD has, I said, lower psychoactive effects. It actually has no psychoactive effects. But how one gets these cannabinoids out of the plant is critical to know what you're actually getting. And I'll get back to the question of what you're actually getting if you get it from a dispensary or online later in the talk. But just, the point that these really are the same plants, the hemp plant and the medical marijuana plant, is that the pathway, the biosynthetic pathway of these cannabinoids are driven by a few different enzymes that drive the plant either to produce THC or CBD. So no plant has high in THC and CBD because there is a switch that happens that either pushes a plant in this direction or that direction. Some of these other cannabinoids like CBGA and THCA, people are thinking about for extracting and making therapeutic aspects of this. And as I said, some of the flavonoids and terpenoids are also metabolites that people think might be useful for human biology. So THC acts on the endocannabinoid system. This is a naturally occurring system within the body where lipids are metabolized into two compounds called 2-AG or 2-arachidonyl glycerol or anandamide. And these two lipids then act on receptors called CB1 or cannabinoid type 1 or CB2, cannabinoid type 2 receptors. And this activates a series of downstream pathways within the cell that alter the function of cells. And the body has enzymes to produce and metabolize these. And these compounds are actually released by synapses or even postsynaptically to alter the physiology of cells and also alter immune function too, because the CB1 receptors are highly active within the immune system. So there's this immune modulatory component potentially of THC, and because THC binds to both CB1 and CB2 receptors. So THC binds to these receptors with moderate affinity. There are compounds that bind with much higher affinity, and there's been in the news these street cannabinoids that have been causing people to like hallucinate that have extreme high affinity to the CB1 receptor. Like I said, these actions of this alter synaptic function and produces the symptoms that we all know about by smoking marijuana. I shouldn't say that anyone personally knows, but potentially knows by smoking marijuana, including the high, the reduction in pain, reducing spasticity, and enhancing appetite. CBD, on the other hand, actually binds to the cannabinoid receptors with very low affinity. And there's some evidence to suggest that CBD might actually block the action of THC or other molecules at the CB1 receptor. So it can be a CB1 antagonist. CB1 changes neuronal signaling, and the current view of this is that it works through what's called the G protein coupled receptor, or GPR55. It antagonizes this, altering the downstream properties of this, which then changes neuronal function, and for the case of epilepsy, changes the neuronal function in a positive way. It also might act on what's called TRPV receptors and have mitochondrial effects. There's some other data to suggest that could even activate serotonin receptors or be neuroprotective and have anti-inflammatory effects. Some of this work is, a lot of this work from a basic science perspective is ongoing, with labs having varying views of these things. But the GPR55 signaling pathway effect of CBD seems to be the pathway that's coming most to the fore. So as I've already said, cannabis has these broad effects that that many people have experienced if they have used marijuana recreationally. The other thing to note when you're talking about medical marijuana is to be honest about that there are health problems associated with medical marijuana use. Now, this is primarily with smoking it, because burning the leaves, the dried leaves, does produce chemicals besides THC and the cannabinoids and terpenes that can activate the respiratory system, cause chronic bronchitis, cause large airway obstruction. But there is currently no association of chronic marijuana use and the development of lung cancer, probably just because it hasn't been studied enough. So some people do think there is a potential risk there for chronic marijuana smokers. There is addiction to marijuana, up to 5 to 10% in some literature of adult users can potentially become dependent on the use of marijuana, and this is potentially higher in children. So when Sanjay Gupta first started to report on this, and it became all the rage in the pediatric epilepsy field, child neurologists like myself were very concerned that if we were giving children medical marijuana, that there'd be this concern about the development of dependency in children. And then even more concerning was this potential long-term issues with cognition and schizophrenia. And there's actually good bodies of literature that suggest that chronic use of recreational marijuana that's high in THC, actually can lower your IQ over years. And there's this association with the development of schizophrenia in teens and young adults. And the data does suggest that those with chronic use of recreational marijuana during their late teenage years and early adulthood do have an increased risk of developing schizophrenia. Some argue there's a chicken and the egg phenomena going on here, but there is a clear association between recreational use and the development of schizophrenia in youth, teenagers, and young adults. So, so with that, I'm going to switch on to what we know about the clinical uses in the neurodevelopmental disabilities for medical marijuana. And as I said at the beginning, people have thought about this for years. And an Israeli group back in 1978 had actually been looking at the effect of high CBD strains or hemp strains of cannabis for those with temporal lobe epilepsy. And they showed that, 2 patients became seizure-free, 1 unchanged, whereas the 4 patients who were on placebo had no effect with no adverse events. And so there's this early literature that arose. But after Dr. Gupta had his show, there all of a sudden was this explosion of use for high CBD strains of medical marijuana for the treatment of epilepsy. And with all the anecdotes that were coming up, GW Pharma, which was a British company, actually approached a few child neurologists and adult neurologists. A group of 5 of us originally included myself, Dr. Davinsky at NYU, Dr. Cilio at UCSF, Dr. Thiel in Boston, and I'm leaving someone out, which I shouldn't be doing, but I am, about potentially them making a product that was very high in CBD, had almost no THC or essentially no THC, and trying it as what's called an expanded access program. So that's what we did. So we started with 5 sites that ended up being a number of other sites that we gave what's now known as Epidiolex, but the purified Cannabidiol to kids. And then we first reported this in Lancet Neurology. And so this is, we had given over 200 kids with CBD, and we looked at the efficacy, but primarily we're looking at safety in this population. And this is just a table. I don't expect anyone to read this, but a table showing just kind of the age and the types of seizures that people had. And in this first expanded access program, you could see the number of different syndromes that was tested on. Now, Phelan-McDermid is not on this list, but Down syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, MECP2 duplication syndrome, CDKL5, tuberculosis, etc., were the many neurodevelopmental disorders that were studied in this paper, which is listed down here in Lancet Neurology. And this was the results. And these are what are called waterfall plots, which show the effect of treatment on these individuals who had a 4-week baseline of counting seizures, followed by looking at their seizures over the course of 12 weeks or the last 4 weeks. And everyone who's above the x-axis here had worsening seizures. So these few patients here had worsening seizures, and these patients here all had improved seizures, with this number of patients having actually becoming seizure-free, which was about 8% of the patients becoming seizure-free. And the other graphs just show you different types. This is total seizures, this is motor seizures, this is total seizures, etc. And overall, there was a 38% reduction in motor seizures, a 60% reduction in atonic seizures, and about 9% were seizure-free, and 11% using just the last 4 weeks of data. And then the Dravet syndrome patients did slightly better. One of the questions that came up is that CBD and THC are potent inhibitors of enzymes in the liver that metabolize drugs. And this system, which is called the CYP system, and particularly inhibits the CYP3A4 and CYP2C19 enzymes. And these enzymes in the liver metabolize benzodiazepines. And this group of patients, these kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities, have a high use of the drug Onfi, as you guys are all probably aware, which is also known as clobazam. So what that means is that people on clobazam in our expanded access program had elevated levels of Onfi or clobazam in their system. And so the question we raised was, is the effect of the purified CBD not independent, but only due to those whose clobazam levels went up? So like, should we just push clobazam levels? And when you look at patients who were on clobazam versus not on clobazam, there is a difference, with those on clobazam doing better, but those without clobazam still had a positive effect of CBD, saying that CBD has effects that are independent of the alteration of benzodiazepine metabolism. And what we have subsequently, a number of different studies have shown, is that there actually seems to be some synergistic effect between clobazam and CBD that is independent of its increasing the level, but CBD does work independently. There also was a more positive effect of those patients on Depakote or valproate, with those on valproate doing better than those not on valproate. So basically, it's a complex interaction that seems to be happening because of CBD's effect on these enzyme systems. And just like to pause here to say, this is why it's important that anyone who goes to try a cannabidiol on their children need to tell their physician, because this drug will interact with other drugs. So it's really important that your physician, your neurologist, your pediatrician knows that you're taking a CBD preparation, whether it's an over-the-counter that you can buy it next to the, next to the checkout stand at CVS, or it's online, or it's from a state dispensary, because it really does have a potent interaction on this. So this is a really important thing to state, and for everyone to remember that you need to tell your physician if you're giving your child any medical marijuana preparation. So after that positive data, GW Pharma decided to actually do the gold standard, to perform a clinical trial of their purified CBD versus placebo. And over about a 5-year period of time, GW ended up having 5 different trials, 2 for Dravet syndrome, 2 for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and 1 for tuberous sclerosis syndrome. And these have all been published, and this is 3 of the 5 publications that came out, 2 of them in the New England Journal of Medicine, the other in Lancet, which is the European version of the New England Journal of Medicine. And all of them had very similar positive results, saying that CBD is effective for the treatment of seizures. And here's just an example of what a clinical trial like this looks like. And here you see that 200 patients were screened. This is for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. 29 failed the screening. Then they were randomized into CBD or placebo. 14 withdrew in the CBD group, 1 withdrew in the placebo group. So these are the number that completed. These were the characteristics of the patients that came in. And you see that these individuals had very frequent seizures, with in both groups having about 70 drop seizures per 28 days. So at least 3 drops per day in this population. So these are individuals with severely intractable epilepsy. And so what did they find? So the primary endpoint of this study was a reduction in drop seizures or major motor seizures. And they found that in the treatment group, which is in blue, there was a 40% reduction. And in the placebo, there was only a 14% reduction. And if you looked just at the last 4 weeks, that this was a little bit higher, and this was statistically significantly different. So there was no doubt from this study and from all the other similar studies that CBD was effective as add-on therapy to the patient's existing drugs to reduce the number of seizures these children were having, children and young adults were having. The other thing they looked at is how the families feel and how the clinicians feel that the kids were doing globally. And this is what you call a caregiver global impression of change. And the caregiver or the physician is then asked, do they think after the treatment, independent of seizures, just overall, how's the individual doing, whether they're, there's no change, whether they're slightly improved, much improved, very much improved, slightly worse, much worse, very much worse. And what you see that if you look at those on the improved side and you put very much, and slightly improved together, there is a significant difference of those on CBD being improved versus those on placebo. And you see that, there are no changes higher in placebo than CBD, suggesting that there was other effects besides seizures on CBD. Now, it's possible that those effects were due to the lowering of seizures, but this got people interested in thinking about, what are the other positive effects of CBD on behavior, on sleep, on anxiety, on attention, etc. Now, the last thing to say is that CBD is a drug, even though it comes from a plant, it is a drug, and that it has adverse effects. And when you looked at the adverse effects in these very formalized clinical trials, you saw that about 18% of the patients developed diarrhea, about 15% developed tiredness or somnolence, 12% had some change in temperature. There was decreased appetite in some, and vomiting. These were all different than in placebo, but not tremendously different. And most of these resolved. We do think that the diarrhea and the vomiting is due to the volume of oil that the CBD is dissolved in, and that it's not a factor of the cannabidiol itself. So what we now know after these trials is that cannabidiol, or purified cannabidiol from the medical marijuana plant, from the cannabis sativa plant, or the cannabis indica plant, is effective for the treatment of seizures. It's not a cure, it's not 100% effective, but it can be effective in many individuals, and it's a generally well-tolerated drug. So what do we know about the other symptoms? And unfortunately, we still don't have good data, and most of what's out there is anecdote from families. And I can tell you many of my families have reported that they've given their child a online preparation of medical marijuana that's high in CBD, and that they sleep better, they do this better, they do that better. But what's the data? Is there anything to support this? And so if you look at effect on behaviors in autism, so this comes from a review just this past year, looking at the potential effects for the treatment of autistic symptoms. And they searched the literature and they found 64 patients in Medline, and a total of 425 papers across many different ways to search the literature. They didn't screen through these to see how were good quality data, and it wasn't just like a random case report of someone saying that their kid got better, that a physician reported that their patient got better with some symptom. And of all these, they were after looking for duplicates, they were only able to find 9 papers that they thought had high quality data. And from those 9 papers, almost all of them being open label or not placebo-controlled studies, all of them being open label studies, that there is some evidence that it can help with self-injurious behaviors, hyperactivity, irritability, aggressiveness, sleep, anxiety, restlessness, psychomotor agitation. So all the things that people have reported to me that were reported in the epilepsy trials have also been kind of confirmed in some small number of studies. Again, these aren't the gold standard placebo-controlled studies. I'm just going to highlight one of the studies. This was published just now almost 3 years ago, in the journal Frontiers in Pharmacology. And this was a study out of Israel. Turns out that Israel is actually on the forefront of doing studies for medicinal marijuana. I think I mentioned earlier that one of the first studies by Meshulam in 1978 was from Israel, and the identification of THC was actually happened in a lab in Israel. And like I said, most of the reports have been anecdote, news stories, etc. But this study had 53 patients at a mean age of 11, between 4 and 22 years. They got purified cannabidiol from the plant for about 66 days, but varied from 30 to 588. And they gave the parents questionnaires that were questionnaires about self-injury, hyperactivity, sleep, anxiety. And what they found that across all of these domains, there were positive improvements. So 67% reported improvements in self-injury and rage attacks, only 9% improved worsening, 68% improved hyperactivity, 71% improved sleep, 47% anxiety, but worsening in 23%. And the adverse effects were the same as in all the epilepsy trials, which is some sleepiness, some change in appetite, and some GI changes, particularly diarrhea. Oops, whoa, going fast there. So again, unfortunately, we still don't have great data in autism, and there are people who are doing other studies, and there's ongoing studies trying to more formally show that CBD has effects, and people are also considering doing low-dose THC for some of these effects for individuals with autism. And then for sleep, this is again another review from 2020 that looked at 4,300 papers when they were done going through and screening and excluding all of these out. They were down to 12 clinical studies and 14 preclinical studies that had the quality of evidence that it's called the PRISMA quality of evidence for this. And then even if you look at those 12 clinical papers, there was issues in the red, saying that there's issues in the bias and how good of quality this data is. And you see there's still questions about some of these papers, though a few had very little risk of bias and the data could be trusted. And what they found overall is that there's a positive effect on sleep, in sleep initiation and potentially even sleep maintenance, as well as restless legs and a few other sleep-related problems with using CBD for purified CBD for treatment of sleep-related issues. So overall, behaviors, anxiety, hyperactivity, sleep, epilepsy, there's positive data suggesting, but the strongest data by far is for epilepsy. So at this point, the only thing you can prescribe this for, CBD for, is for epilepsy, but there are a lot of hints out there that maybe there's something real for the treatment of these other symptoms, but more research needs to occur. So then, if, as you've inevitably heard from on Facebook or from friends of friends that, oh, my kid got CBD from this online dispensary or from a local state dispensary, and he's so much calmer, he sleeps better, all these positive things that we've all heard, and you go out there and get it. So what do you have to worry about there if you go out there and get it? And so this is one of a couple papers that have actually tried to look at what you're getting if you go to a state dispensary or an online purveyor of CBD. And so they got 40 products that were CBD extracted in oil, in alcohol, or was used to be vaped, 24 products, so a total of 84 products. They then analyzed the cannabidiol content of those products. And what they found, that about half were accurately labeled. A quarter were under labeled, so there was less CBD than they said in there, and a quarter were over labeled. There was more CBD. Other studies have actually shown that products where they say there's no THC, that there actually is some THC in there, and some projects where they say there's little THC, there could be even more, or there could be none in it. So this paper, and I think I said there's at least 3 other papers that have done this same type of study, where they've analyzed the content, have shown that you have to be careful getting from online dispensaries and state dispensaries. And then when you talk about state dispensaries, you need to know what the state legality is, because you don't want to get yourself in trouble for getting cannabidiol or marijuana in any shape or form if it's illegal in your state. Though by federal law, hemp production and pure CBD is actually legal to be produced and sold on a federal basis. But marijuana remains illegal on a federal basis, both to grow and to sell or transport across state laws, though the Department of Justice has basically ignored this in states that have legalized marijuana. And this map, which comes from, this is an up-to-date map that comes from this website down here, which lists which states have completely legalized marijuana, and those are in black, which states have allowed medical and decriminalized recreational marijuana in dark green, those that allow medical marijuana in this lighter shade of green, which is where I am at in Pennsylvania, states that have decriminalized it, and then states where it's fully illegal. So in those states, you do need to be careful. So with that, I am going to wrap up. And say that cannabis is a complex plant that has a number of compounds with various potential therapeutic applications. And the ones that we know the most about is cannabidiol for epilepsy, and then THC from its recreational use. There are long-term health-related issues of smoking the dried leaf. Not that you're going to have kids with Phelan-McDermid smoke marijuana. CBD is safe and effective for pediatric epilepsies and is FDA approved for a variety of pediatric epilepsies. There's less data on the behavioral, sleep, and autistic features of cannabidiol, so you have to be careful with it. And really just like to stress the importance of making sure that your pediatrician, your neurologist, your geneticist, whoever is primarily overseeing your child's care, is aware if you're giving your child any preparation of medical marijuana high in CBD with a little THC. They're aware of it because of its interactions with other drugs. And then using state dispensaries potentially has some limitations in that certain states that the quality of the product that you're getting is going to vary and can vary from time to time you get there. These dispensaries have no guarantee to give you the same thing twice. So that's the other issue with the state dispensaries, is that there could be variability. Some states have been enacting rules to ensure the quality of the product, that it has to be tested from point A, which is the growing, to the extracting, to the producing the product. And then when it goes to the shelf, Pennsylvania is one of those states, but other states don't have those rules, and the producers can kind of produce whatever they want without significant oversight of that. And with that, I will end and take any questions. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Marsh. That was fantastic. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure many people on the call did as well. So we do have a couple of questions already, and please feel free to continue to put questions in the Q&A. It's easier for us to manage there. And just as a reminder, Dr. Marsh cannot give specific medical advice, but can answer more general questions. So there was a question earlier on in the talk, which I believe you did answer, and maybe you could reiterate, but the question was, has there been any research on CBD use for drop seizures or atonic seizures? I did see in the data that it has seemed to be successful. So if you could just reiterate that, but also a second part to the question would be, are there any major seizure types where it has been shown that CBD is not very helpful? Because people with PMS experience 5 different, seizure types.
5 seizure types, yeah. So, for the LGS studies, the phase 3 studies, the primary endpoint was drop seizures, atonic and drop seizures. And so it was definitely effective for atonic and drop seizures. In my experience, the one seizure type that it seems to have the least effective is absence seizures. There was a different company that actually was going to do a small absence trial, and they did like a pre-trial and then they stopped. So concerning that it was not effective for that. And Yeah, so that's, the one seizure type that seems to be the least effective is for absence, and what's most effective for is probably drops in generalized tonic-clonic seizures.
Great, thank you so much. A second question we have is there a specific way of taking CBD that is recommended or commonly prescribed, edibles, drops, etc.?
Right. So it's a complicated question because it turns out that CBD it's a lipid-like compound. So its absorption in the gut is not the greatest way to get it in. Turns out that getting it, inhaling it, is actually a much more effective way of getting it in. People have talked about transdermal patches. People have talked about like vaping or even suppositories, as they'd have better absorption. However, there are, getting a child with a developmental disability to inhale something is not so easy. You're not going to know what the dose is. It's hard to kind of measure a dose in that case. So at this point, we still recommend to go with an oral preparation. And the most of the oral preparations are in oils. Some of the tinctures that could be used have alcohol, so you just try to be careful with how much alcohol you're giving somebody. So at this point, it's still kind of oil-based preparation is better than any other way, though there are people who are thinking about different ways to get the compound in, because one of the questions people ask is, could it be even more effective if it got in better? And that those people who respond really well to CBD, is their metabolism such that they actually absorb it better and they have higher levels of it? So right now the recommendation is still just an oil is the kind of the safest and best way to do it. But that is to be determined into the future.
Great, thank you. The next question is there any research comparing the use of CBD either in comparison or in conjunction with a keto diet or other therapies?
Right. So there's no head-to-head studies of CBD versus the keto diet. For epilepsy studies in general, the way people have approached this for the last 30 years is as add-on therapy on top of other medications versus placebo. So there's no studies that would tell you whether it is better head-to-head versus the keto diet. In my experience, we have a lot of our patients who are on the diet who then went on CBD, and there was added benefit of it. And some of those patients who had been on the diet for a long time, we were able to take them off the diet and they continued to do well. There's no contraindication of using CBD with the diet. And since it's an oil, you don't have to adjust the diet in any way, because it doesn't it doesn't take you out of ketosis.
Thank you. We have a very similar question, which is about a couple of specific drugs, if you have heard of if there's a synergistic effect or not. Diazepam and baclofen. Have you heard anything or seen anything about CBD working synergistically?
Yeah, so the same enzyme system in the liver that metabolizes clobazam also metabolizes diazepam, so there would be the same kind of synergistic increase effect of diazepam. Baclofen, to be honest, I don't know if baclofen's metabolized. Baclofen is a GABA B receptor antagonist versus the others, which are GABA A receptor agonists. And so I actually don't know. It's a good question. I'd have to look up. But one thing you can look up on, MD Consult or whatever is how is baclofen metabolized? And if it's metabolized by that CYP3A4-2C19, then there would be an interaction with it.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, do kids require increasing doses over time? Do they seem to develop tolerance or need to increase dose as they grow?
Yeah, so that's, one of the things that we actually looked at in the expanded access program, because we were following these kids for years before it was FDA approved, is did we see a loss of effectiveness over time. So there's actually a paper, I think it was published in Epilepsy in 2019, where we actually looked at that question, and we found that there was actually pretty good persistence of effect over time without having to increase dose. So yeah, if your kid's growing a lot, yeah, you probably do want to do some dose adjustment by weight, but we haven't seen a tolerance develop, or what we call a tachyphylaxis, it's the medical term, for losing efficacy over time.
Great, thank you. We have a similar question of how do parents even start to, get to the right dosage of CBD if doctors can't always give a prescription and just a recommendation?
Yeah, so what I would say to that is start low and build it up slowly. So try to figure out what the amount of the CBD is in the preparation you get. Like online, it should tell you the milligrams of CBD per mLs of the solution that you have. And a good kind of rule of thumb would be to start at like 1/2 milligram per kilogram per day, divided in 2 doses, or divided in 3 doses, whatever you prefer. And that would be a good kind of starting dose. If you go to the Realm of Caring's website, that's kind of where they're putting you at. They're starting you at about 0.25 milligrams per kilogram per day. I would say start more like at 0.5, but start low, and then count your child's seizures. And if you don't see any effect, increase the dose in small increments. With the frequency that you would know whether you're having an effect on your child's seizures or behaviors. If your child has aggression or self-injurious behaviors, they're doing it every day. Like after 3 days, if you don't see an effect, then go up. But just go low and go slow, and that would be kind of a general rule of thumb that would work for this.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question that's pretty similar to a couple of the questions we just asked, so it might be a little bit of a reiteration, but can some kids with epilepsy be on CBD only, or is it typically always taken in addition to anti-epileptic drugs in these studies?
Yeah, so in the studies, it was as add-on therapy. So it was given in addition to their other anti-epileptic drugs. I can tell you that in my clinical experience, we've had some kids who've done really, really well, and we were able to take them off of pretty much, we have a few kids who we've taken them off everything besides CBD. And we have a few where we've got them down to just CBD and a little bit of Depakote, or just CBD and a little bit of clobazam, or just a little bit of something else. So most cases you're not going to start CBD as primary therapy because it's not approved that way, so you're going to have a hard time getting insurance to approve it if you're doing that direction. And you should talk to your doctor about, if your child has new onset seizures, about going online and getting something versus a standard seizure med. My recommendation would be to try a standard seizure medication first, and if you have no side effects and it works, then to stick with that. If you have side effects or it doesn't work, then CBD becomes an option later on.
Great, that's really good to know. Okay, so we don't have any other questions currently. If anybody has any further questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A over the next minute or so. I really appreciate these questions because they're general, and I think they apply to everybody who will be watching this recording. So we appreciate that they're not terribly specific. Anybody has any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll just give you a minute to do that. And thank you, Dr. Marsh. This has been very, very insightful, and I've learned a lot.
Great, you're welcome. My pleasure.
All right, so I don't see, oh wait, maybe we got another one.
So one more there popped up.
Yeah.
So it's similar to the last answer, but the question is many times it's recommended to try a few different types of AEDs. At what point do you recommend try CBD? My answer to that question is I usually would like to see someone fail at least one and probably a second medication before I go to CBD. There's no absolute right answer to that. You might have, your physician might want you to try a third. Your physician might be okay after trying one, but somewhere in that, lead to fail or beyond 1 to 2 before going CBD, in my opinion.
We have one more question in the Q&A, but I actually have a question also myself. Just a common theme of a lot of these seminar series that we have is families having a hard time getting physicians to prescribe certain things or responding to certain needs. Do you have any advice for families in some of these states where they may be able to get a prescription, but it's not as common, in how they talk to their doctor about it?
Yeah. So, I think what I would say, if you don't have, it's actually good for Phelan-McDermid at some point, if the EEG gets abnormal enough, could they co-carry a diagnosis of LGS? Or the FDA indication is seizures associated with LGS, so which includes atonic seizures and drop seizures. So you could say, hey, this is sort of approved for, it overlaps with my child and it's approved for it. So that's one way if you want to go the Epidiolex FDA approved route. Otherwise, to say to your physician, are you aware that there's actually really good data for the use of CBD for the treatment of seizures, that the data has shown that it works for many different seizure types and many different syndromes, even though the approval is only for 3. If you look at our original expanded access protocol, we had 20 different syndromes listed there. So, ask them if they're aware of it, and that if they'd be willing to supervise you to getting from a state dispensary or online, and that you would go carefully, you would do it under their supervision, but that there's data out there to support that it's worth trying. And that's kind of how I would approach it.
Great, thank you. We have gotten a couple more questions in the last couple minutes that we'll end with. One of them in the Q&A is, have you heard of issues with nursing staff being able to administer CBD ever, especially in group homes or hospitals?
Yeah, so if it's the FDA approved version, no, there's obviously no issue. If you're getting it from a state dispensary, then there are issues, and that we've had to deal with, where the nursing agencies or a group home will not administer it. So then the parent has to administer it. I can tell you that at CHOP, for in-hospital, we have families sign a waiver, and then they have to give it with the nurse there. They have to give it themselves with the nurse there, but they're allowed to give it in the hospital. But they have to have a medical marijuana card. They can't just be randomly doing it. Though if they are getting it from an online dispensary, the hospital still sort of allows them to do it as long as they register it in the system. So hospitals, I think, are being more flexible, but group homes and nursing agencies can still be a pain about that. Not that they're a pain, but you know what I mean.
Thank you. And the last question that I think we'll end on is, it's asking if you would repeat anything that you're supposed to look for when buying CBD on an online dispensary. I think you mentioned some things that, the advertising is not always what is actually in there. Is there anything positive that people or certain, it's not a specific dispensary per se, but anything people should look for that might indicate it's a more legitimate dispensary? Yeah,
so that they will upfront list the concentration that they would have a report of the testing of it, where they'll say, oh, look, here's a certified lab that has tested it. Those are the two things to kind of ask for, to have, some of the bigger online dispensaries actually will do that. They will report out their testing. So those are the things, that to make sure that they actually list a legitimate concentration. It doesn't just say something like, it contains, at least this amount of CBD, but it says it has this milligrams per ml, or this number of milligrams in the 30 mLs that's in the bottle or So we want them to be specific about what they list, and then potentially even offer the evidence of testing.
Great. And I know I've said this 3 times now, but there is one last question in the Q&A, and we have 2 minutes left. How does one get into a CBD clinical trial? I know it would have to be covering, the disorder, but can you say anything about this process in other disorders?
Yeah, so, for clinical trials in general, one place to look to see if there's an active clinical trial is clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov is a great one-stop shop for seeing what's in there. So if you type in clinicaltrials.gov and cannabidiol in the search term, you'll see all the active trials. And if there's a location close to you, you can call up, they have contact information. You can call up the site and ask them what the inclusion criteria are, and see if, if it's for like sleep in neurodevelopmental disorders, would Phelan-McDermid be included in that? Would it be excluded? And that's the way to do it. So the best way to find us is clinicaltrials.gov. I don't know if you guys, some foundations have trial finders as well. I don't know if you guys do. So if you do, maybe you can link CBD to your trial finder as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think this has been a really, really great session. Thank you, Dr. Marsh, for taking your time to be with us. We've learned so much, and this recording will be available in the conference app, and we hope that everyone enjoys it. So thank you very much, and we hope you all have a great day.
Bye, everyone.